1933, a chapter in the history of mankind ended. The occasion went unnoticed, except by a few people on the remote Chatham Islands, east of New Zealand.
Hold on a moment, please. Friends, we are gathered here today to pay our last respect to our friend Tame Horomona Rihi, otherwise known to us all as Tommy Solomon. The passing of our friend is full of interest and regret, because not only have we lost a friend, but the world has lost a race of people. We know by the passing away of others that Tommy was the last full-blooded Moriori, the original inhabitants of these islands. Now he is gone. The race is extinct.
Of a people who'd lived on the Chatham Islands for 1,000 years. Their peaceful isolation was broken last century, and their culture tragically destroyed forever. The last Moriori, Tommy Solomon, has descendants living in New Zealand. Incredibly, the story of his people, who they were, how they lived, and why they died, has been lost to his family.
We'll see you later, Mum.
Yeah.
Enjoy it. Yeah, all too. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, kids.
To rediscover that extraordinary story, two of Tommy Solomon's grandchildren are leaving their home on the New Zealand mainland to visit the Chatham Islands. Margaret and Charles Solomon have been brought up on false myths which depicted the Moriori as New Zealand's first primitive inhabitants, who were driven from the mainland to the Chatham Islands by the superior Maori race.
I've always felt as if there was something missing. I think of myself more as a Maori than anything, because there's nothing Moriori around me.
Margaret is a farmer's wife and mother of 6 children. Her brother Charles is a meat worker and territorial soldier.
You know, I feel proud of being a Moriori, or part Moriori. Well, I think it's just fantastic, really, that I've got this chance to learn more about the Morioris. I mean, I've been quite ignorant.
Ignorance and confusion are widespread, although much research into the Moriori has been done. Before flying to the Chathams, Margaret and Charles visit the Otago Museum and University to meet some of the people who've studied the Moriori.
Doug, this is Margaret and Charles Solomon. Doug Sutton. And Doug's been responsible for major archaeological...
Strangely, the academics and the living descendants of the Moriori have never come together until this moment. Otago University recently undertook a major archaeological expedition in the Chatham Islands. It was led by Dr. Doug Sutton. Many tons of material excavated from a 16th century Moriori village were brought back here for analysis. For the first time, it's been possible to build up a detailed picture of everyday Moriori life as it was 400 years ago.
We've established, within limits of accuracy, of course, where the Morioris came from, when they arrived in the Chathams, how their culture adapted to the fairly hazardous environment in the islands, and how they came to an end, which they very nearly did, apart from yourselves, of course.
This is an X-ray of a very ancient Moriori skull.
Philip Houghton from the Anatomy Department of the Otago Medical School.
They're very distinctive Polynesian features, and they appear in a very marked form in the Moriori. And one of the most distinctive things is this very curved jaw, what anthropologists call the rocker jaw. In the early Moriori photographs here, the Moriori, I like to say, are the most Polynesian of Polynesians. Their heads were big to match these large jaws. I think this is where they really stand out from the Maori.
It was once thought the Moriori were an inferior Melanesian people, but this was disproved by a former director here at the Otago Museum, Dr. H.D. Skinner. He passed on his interest to ethnologist Dave Simmons, who shows Margaret and Charles how the Polynesian origin of the Moriori was proved over 50 years ago. Skinner pointed out the similarity of their adzes to others from Polynesia.
Or the other one that you're holding there, which comes from Hawaii. Now, that tells you something Dr. Skinner pointed out in 1923, that in fact the ancestors of the Moriori were not people from Melanesia or people chased out of New Zealand, but in fact were people from Polynesia who settled the Chathams.
Skinner's book is still the main source of knowledge about the Moriori. It includes writings from other observers.
But another way, in fact, which actually puts flesh onto the bare bones of archaeology and academic knowledge, is from the writing of the ancestors themselves. An ancestor such as Hiruwana Tapu, who was one of your relatives, who was a child at the age of about 11 when the Maori took over the Chathams, and who wrote what he knew of the traditions of his own people. I'd like for you to take this with you to the Chathams and learn about your ancestors.
Thanks so much.
And perhaps I can say to you farewell in the language of your ancestors and wish you well in finding the things of your ancestors in the Chathams. Hariatu ki reikuhu, ke kakea o karapuna, hariatu haere. No reira.
The flight from Christchurch to the Chathams is Margaret's first time in the air. She and Charles are now equipped with the information they need to rediscover a forgotten people, to retrace the paths of their ancestors. The Moriori were the first to cross this ocean, after sailing further from their homeland than any other Polynesian group. The widely scattered islands of Polynesia are in a triangle stretching from Hawaii in the north across to Easter Island and south to New Zealand and the Chatham Islands. The Samoa-Tonga area was the womb of Polynesian culture. Its basic features developed here between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. From these islands, the first Polynesians began their journeys of colonization. At the beginning of the Christian era, they spread into the Marquesas and Society Islands, where a distinctive East Polynesian culture developed during the next 500 years. Later migrations established the outer reaches of Polynesia. By at least 600 AD, Hawaii and Easter Island were settled. New Zealand was reached later. At this stage, the story of the Moriori begins. The Chatham Islands were settled in the same period as New Zealand, between 800 and 1000 AD. It's not clear whether the first settlers came directly to the Chathams or from New Zealand. There was probably a period of voyaging between the two island groups, but contact had ended by at least 1400. The Moriori developed differently from the New Zealand Maori because of the different environment. The main island, Chatham, is like a sponge, soggy peatland pitted with lakes and a huge lagoon. The Moriori called their island Rekohu, Island of Mists. Today, there are only a few descendants of the Moriori left on the island. Most of them are Solomons.
Hi, Uncle Tom.
Hey, Mac.
It's a long time since the cousins last met.
You're getting fatter every day.
What about yourself? Gary! G'day! Oh, good to see you.
On arrival, the Polynesian custom is to pay homage to previous generations. Near the airport, Margaret and Charles and two of their cousins visit some of the few surviving memorials of earlier Moriori. On some of these trees are examples of the unique Moriori carvings. This is the starting point of Margaret and Charles' pilgrimage. They were told in Dunedin what to look for by Dave Simmons.
The carvings on the kopi are usually found in groups, in groves, facing inwards, and what's being represented here are the gods and the ancestors. This one, for instance, would seem to represent a local ancestor from the Hapupu region. He has a kuranui, or a headdress, which denotes that he was a chief.
Spotted a tree here, Charles. It's got the same design as that one we were looking at the museum, hasn't it? What would this be? Ribs? Ribs, do you think?
Oh, it could have been. Most likely, you can't see any legs or anything now.
No. Look, there's the arms.
You still can see the three fingers there on the end of the arms. See that?
You see, this one could even be one of our ancestors.
Could be.
Couldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the carvings were probably done in the last 200 years. They're only few and far between now. They are disappearing at a very fast rate.
Margaret and Charles must travel to the other end of the island to reach their family's land. The bleak landscape is quite different to what they've come from. But the contrast was much greater for the first people arriving here from tropical Polynesia. The Moriori were about the only Polynesians entirely dependent on hunting, gathering, and fishing. Their most remarkable feature, though, was their pacifism. They lived without war for centuries, while their territory was undisturbed by invaders. Although no longer totally isolated, the Chathams are still a world away from mainland New Zealand. Roads have been built only recently. Many of the native birds and plant species have suffered the same fate as the native people. In Moriori times, there were probably between 2,000 and 3,000 people living here. Today's population is only 500. The hub of downtown Waitangi is the island's only store. The economy today is based on the exceptionally rich marine life, as it was in Moriori times. Manukau, the tribal home of Margaret and Charles' forebears. Their cousin Benny now manages the land developed as one of the Chatham's best farms by Tommy Solomon. It's marked on the map as an historic site. The grave of the last Moriori.
Well, Margaret, Charles, this is our grandfather. He's been here for a long time now.
Yeah, well, it was 1933. It's a long time, all right.
And I think he'll be pleased to see the family back.
Sort of a funny feeling, isn't it?
It is.
Tommy Solomon was a big man. When he died, the coffin was so large a hole had to be cut in the wall of his house to get it out. The house is now derelict, awaiting demolition. It was once home for a former manager of the farm, Bob Jacobs, who's now in his 80s.
How many children were in Granddad's family?
He told me there was about 20, and they all died within 2 weeks of age. And when he was born, his father told his mother that we'll get some condensed milk and feed this one on condensed milk, and which they did. Mm-hmm. And he patted his belly and said, "I'm satisfied."
The house was built by Tommy Solomon. He's remembered as a jovial person, a formidable athlete, until the weight problem which killed him took over. He was 50 when he died. Tommy competed successfully in the world he found himself in, largely discarding whatever was left of his heritage. Much knowledge of the past has been buried with the Moriori. There are many things we do not know about their customs, language, and general way of life. Yet it's only 150 years since the Solomon ancestors were living here as they had for centuries before, untouched by the outside world.
The Manukau area is ideal for prehistoric Moriori settlement, sheltered from the prevailing wind, and at the same time it was an area covered by a vast expanse of broadleaf forest, which was teeming with bird life, which the Morioris exploited. There was a fur seal breeding colony present. They had a lot of shellfish, most of which of course are now gone due to the commercial overexploitation. So the Manukau almost certainly was a better area for Moriori settlement than many other areas in the island. And in this area somewhere there was a major Moriori village.
You can clearly see the outlines of the two houses over there.
Yeah.
They were small compared to this big area around here.
It's a real large one.
You know, this could have easily been a meeting house or some sort.
Now, there were at least 5 types of houses used by the Morioris. The ones we excavated were occupied throughout the year and may, in fact, have been the only type of house that was used for this purpose. They were large rectangular houses, about 7 metres by 3, and they had a single gable down the long axis of the house, and the eaves fell almost to the ground on both sides. And this is the type of house which is being reconstructed in the Chathams at the moment.
Up we go. 1, 2. Right on this one. Yep. Down this end, George. Look at that pagan before that end comes out.
The plan of Doug Sutton's archaeological site has been used as the basis for this reconstruction of a 16th century village. Local scouts, the Chatham Island Museum and others in the community are helping in this first ever attempt at recreating a Moriori settlement. In the final stages of construction, Charles adds his contribution.
How's it, Charles? Not too bad, is it?
No, not.
With the buildings completed, it's not difficult to take the next step of the imagination to envisage Moriori life as it was 400 years ago. Imagining their ancestors' way of life is no match for actually trying out some of their activities. Charles is eager to put his newfound knowledge of the Moriori to the practical test. He's teamed up with his cousin Raymond Solomon, who lives on the Chathams.
I reckon. What do you reckon our ancestors used to use this for bait?
Oh, quite possible. We've seen some hooks down at the Otago University in the museum, and the Moriori hooks, or some are made out of whale bone, some out of stone, and Dave Simmons, who was showing us these artefacts, he reckoned it was quite possible that the Moriori would tie bits of bait around the end of the hook. Once the fish grabbed it, they could snare it up in their mouth. So, yeah, I suppose they did.
So boys, catch some fish, I'll cook them Moriori style.
The village we excavated, we found to be highly structured. It was laid out in plan as a series of activity areas. On the leeward side of the village, we had a series of rubbish dumps. This is where all the offal and kitchen refuse and things were disposed of. They were put down on the leeward side, clearly, so the smell wouldn't cross the village and come to the other side. Cooking was undertaken quite significantly between the rubbish dumps and the areas in which people lived. They didn't cook in the houses. Instead, they cooked in quite a large area, which we found to be covered in heat-fractured stones, and which we found to comprise a whole series of hearths, small cooking hearths. Now, between the cooking area and the sea, there were two other activity areas. First, there was a large area of houses, and we estimate, although we only excavated 3 houses, we estimate that there have been about a dozen houses on this mound at the time of its occupation in the 16th century AD. This village plan reflects the Moriori attitude to tapu. Between the houses and the sea, the Morioris living in this place buried their dead. The burials were sacred and are closest to the sea and are away from all domestic and food preparation activities on the site.
The gathering and preparation of food was surrounded by rituals and rules. Some tasks were for women, some for men, and each family fended for itself. Most of their diet came from the sea. The main vegetable was fernroot, which was first roasted, scraped and beaten. The Solomons are joined by another cousin, Marion.
What are you doing?
This is our tea.
Well, I suppose I'm game enough to try anything once.
Pull away the fibres.
It's definitely got a taste of its own. Yeah. I nearly done it.
Really foul.
Who's hungry round here?
I am. Bring it
Oh,
over.
look, it's just cooked to a tea. Look at that.
Oh, look at that.
Still hungry?
It doesn't look like the cob we gave you. Ladies first.
Yeah. It's lovely and juicy, isn't it? You gonna have a piece, Marion? Oh, here's a nice bit here.
Not bad.
Hey?
Bit of salt. A bit of salt here.
It's gone to spoil
Bit
it.
of salt. Okay.
Come on, Charles, you have some. Mmm.
It tastes nice.
A bit of nice. It's
You know, I wonder what they used to do at night for entertainment. You know, like after they've eaten a meal or while they're eating a meal.
Well, they must have been musical, because, I mean, look at all us. We're all musical, aren't we? Well, we like our music and our sing-song, so, you know, cheerful and so forth, so they must have been that way inclined.
They didn't have no propaganda.
In this game, the movement of the feathered sticks symbolized a bird in flight. One of the songs described the island as seen by a swan.
There were a number of symbols and a number of things that they used in the dances and in the rituals associated with the birds, particularly with the albatross and the times when they're hunting the albatross. This okewa patu, made out of schist, is in the shape of an albatross, as you can see, the bird shape. It's not so well weighted as a weapon, but it could be used very well as something which is waved around in a dance when you're doing the ceremonies for the albatross.
The flesh of the young albatross was a great delicacy. Expeditions to the offshore breeding colonies were a test of the birder's manhood. They took great care to placate the spirits with rituals such as observing celibacy before setting out. The weather conditions had to be just right. Margaret and Charles' grandfather was one of the few survivors of the last albatross hunt about 80 years ago. Tommy Solomon and his friends had ignored the advice of their elders not to go. Their canoes were swamped, and most of the party was drowned. Even in a modern fishing boat, the trip to one of the albatross colonies can be an ordeal. After 3.5 hours on the water, a seasick Margaret and Charles are thankful they don't have to face the hardest part, landing on the treacherous rocks. The Moriori regarded the majestic albatross as almost sacred. The numbers clubbed to death were strictly controlled. No more than could be carried back in their canoes.
Moriori boats, the only ones they had, are quite well known, in fact. They're a very distinctive type of boat known as the wash-through raft. And these have long been regarded by ethnologists as a very primitive form of boat. It's been said that the Morioris couldn't build real canoes like real Polynesians built, but rather that they had to use these rafts because they were short of wood. In fact, looked at more realistically, these wash-through rafts are ideal for the purposes for which they were designed and for the conditions in which they had to operate.
Go!
Charles and Raymond try a reconstructed raft for the first time. It's a much smaller type than the ones used on albatross expeditions.
I'm sick of this. You might as well have a go yourself, Charles.
Well, I ain't going to try. Okay, here you go.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you a push out.
The Chatham Islands is characterised by very rough seas. It's characterised by frequent strong winds and very frequent changes of wind direction. And so narrow, inflexible canoes are unsafe, and sailing canoes are at a disadvantage because of the wind conditions. However, a boat that is lower in the water, shorter, has a greater beam, and particularly lies down in the water and is deep, as we know these Moriori rafts were, is a very stable and safe platform, particularly for short drift voyages, as in the case of going out to the Albatross colonies, and particularly for landing on these colonies. Now, people in the Wildlife Service at the moment who do work on the Albatross, they use a Zodiac dinghy, which is kind of a facsimile of the Moriori wash-through raft.
Machu kakimi. Machu pokai. Machu amio. Machu kihahau. Machu kakuti. Machu motorere. Machu takoto. Machu kata. Machu kangafa. Machu hoparangi. Machu titori katoa.
The chant last echoed around these spectacular basalt columns when the Moriori made his adzes here. This rock was in demand by the Moriori as it is by today's Chatham Islanders. At a nearby quarry, it's extracted for roads and a new airport. But the evidence of much earlier quarrying lies undisturbed. The Moriori roughly shaped their stone tools here before taking them away for finishing. Margaret and Charles have discovered the site of an ancient workshop. The stone flakes and adze roughouts still lie where they were discarded by Moriori craftsmen centuries ago.
It's very similar to that one in the museum, really, isn't it? It's not much difference.
Yes, you can see it.
Look, here's a chip here. You see that?
Yeah.
Maybe it could have been flaked off there.
Yeah. Come on, put a bit of muscle into it.
Kaingaroa, or Skirmish Bay, on the northeast coast, where the history of the Moriori changed course. What happened here marked the beginning of the end. The long isolation was abruptly broken in 1791 with the arrival of the first Europeans. They left a full account.
After sailing about 10 leagues, we come abreast of a small sandy bay. With our glasses, we observed some people hauling up a canoe and several others behind the rocks in the bay. Accompanied by Mr. Johnson, the master, and one of the mates, we proceeded towards the shore in a cutter.
The cutter was from the British ship Chatham. Commanded by Lieutenant William Broughton, the Chatham had come from New Zealand in the course of a surveying expedition. Moriori's excitement at this strange apparition was misinterpreted as hostility. Broughton retreated. When he considered the natives had calmed down, he approached again. The discoverers followed the example of Captain Cook in his dealings with Polynesians. The Morioris thought the visitors may have come from the sun. They were unsure of their sex. but decided they must be women. Having cleared the beach, some of the party went ashore. After examining canoes and arbours which had been slept in, they were ready to take possession of the island. It was ceremoniously named after the Earl of Chatham and claimed in the name of King George III, whose health was tested. Having taken possession of the island, another exchange was attempted. Civilization had paid its first visit. The violence on the beach at Kaingaroa was a portent of greater disturbances to follow. In spite of the death, which shattered generations of peace among the Moriori, they resolved to welcome anyone who returned. Reports from the discoverers aroused outside interest. Europeans were especially interested in the island's abundant sea life. The Morioris built their settlements close to seal colonies. They relied on them for food and clothing and took great care to preserve the breeding grounds. The sealers who arrived at the beginning of the 19th century observed no tapus. They plundered the seal colonies, and within 30 years reduced the numbers from 20,000 to just a few. The colonies have never recovered.
Come on, wake up. Yeah. Oh, there he goes. Stand back to jump up.
As a result of the depletion of their main resource and the introduction of new diseases, the Moriori population also began to decline. Mute evidence of the time when seals were here in greater numbers. These and representations of albatross carved in limestone testify to their importance in Moriori culture before it was disrupted.
I wonder what they actually meant, you know, the symbols here. Whether they represent seasons or something like that. The different seasons, like, you know, seals.
The carvings that survive are in caves and on rocks along the shore of the lagoon.
Oh, here we go. Right. Oh, there's a hell of a smell in here. There seems to be a lot of water in here and some spider webs around the ceiling. Oh, yes. Yes, there go some nice ones on the roof. You can really see the beak. And they look more like albatross with their head stretched right up.
This cave is named after a chief called Nanuku. He lived here in very early times and was credited with bringing lasting peace among the Moriori. According to legend, he was aroused one day by the sound of fighting at the north end of the lagoon. He was sickened by the senseless fighting and the eating of human flesh. Nanuku approached the warring tribes and yelled to them to stop. From now and forever, he said, never again let there be war as this day has been. He instructed them to burn their arms, and decreed that in future, if they were angry, the leading disputants could fight with rods. But at the first sight of blood, the duel should end with honor satisfied. Nanuku told them, "From today, forget the taste of human flesh." And the people obeyed because of his curse. May your bowels rot the day you disobey. The story may be a myth, but the fact is, the Morioris, uniquely among Polynesians, lived in peace. They lost the art of warfare and became vulnerable to invasion, but it was a noble experiment which produced 600 years of living in harmony. On the surface, that harmony among the islanders was evident during Margaret and Charles' visit. The friendliness they enjoyed was genuine enough. But some people were unhappy about a revival of interest in the Moriori. Many of the islanders have Maori blood. They'd prefer to forget the gruesome events of last century in which the ancestors of some of them were involved. The destruction of the Moriori people had its origins in tribal warfare among the New Zealand Maoris. The ruthless chief Te Rauparaha held sway over the lower North Island. Members of the Te Atiawa tribe who had moved from Taranaki to Wellington felt threatened by him. By 1835, the Te Atiawa people were planning to flee. One of their chiefs had been on a whaling ship to the Chathams. He persuaded his people that was where they should go. They'd find plenty of food, he reported, and the natives were docile. To cross the 900 kilometers of ocean, they'd need a sailing vessel. So it was decided to seize the next ship to visit Wellington. It was the Rodney, whose captain was persuaded or forced to transport them in 2 trips. There were 500 people packed shoulder to shoulder on the first trip and slightly less on the second. The ship also carried 7 canoes and 700 tons of potatoes, but few provisions for the 3.5-day voyage. When the Maoris arrived in the Chathams, they were thirsty, starving, and defenseless. They'd have been an easy match for the Morioris, who outnumbered them 2 to 1 in 1835. But Nanuku's law forbade them to fight. The invaders were left to establish themselves at Whangaroa, building a pa and planting their precious potatoes. It wasn't long before the other areas of Moriori settlement were threatened. Within a month of arrival, the Maoris began encroaching on their territory, taking food and killing some of the people. Forced to make some response, the Morioris called a meeting at Te Awapatiki, where the lagoon opened into the sea. On this spot, Margaret and Charles' ancestors gathered. A 1,000 Morioris listened as their leaders debated whether or not to defend by force the land which had been theirs undisturbed for centuries. Some urged an assault on the intruders, but the council was won over by the chief of the Rauru tribe, to which Margaret and Charles' people belonged. He urged them to keep their peace covenant and be friendly to the Maoris. The people were told to return, each family to its place or village. Their pacifism was put to the ultimate test. Had taken possession.
We were terrified. We fled to the bush, concealed ourselves in holes underground, and in any place to escape our enemies. It was of no avail. We were discovered and killed, men, women, and children, indiscriminately.
Hirawana Tapu, the great uncle of Tommy Solomon, was a boy of 11 at the time of the invasion. He later wrote,
"The New Zealanders commenced to kill us like sheep, wherever we were found. Some of our people were eaten, and others thrown to the birds of heaven.
Those not killed were taken as slaves. The more attractive women were removed from their husbands to be used by the new masters. Children were separated from their parents. With rare exceptions, the Morioris gave in with pathetic timidity. Any protests were unheard until much later. Tapu became the chief spokesman for his dispossessed people. He was a remarkable man who spoke several languages. In 1862, he articulated the plight of the Moriori in a plea to Governor Grey. The document asked for the return of their land and recounted what had happened.
Let no other people of the world ask why this people were not strong to hold their land. Friend, listen. A people who did not know how to fight. The custom of this land was that when one bled and the other bled, that was it. A people who dwelt in peace. Killing and cannibalism did not exist in this island. Their word for this kind of person was demon, man-eating kaupeke. The manner of this people was like a flock of sheep, living with a word in the place where they were left by the shepherd. And when the shepherd went away, the wild dog came to eat the sheep. The sheep are many, but what is that to the wild dog?
The Moriori slaves were forced into labor that was foreign to them. 5 years after the conquest, a European explorer described their condition. Ulcerated backs bent almost double, emaciated paralytic limbs, diseased lungs. Death must be a blessing. The cause of many deaths was what the Moriori called kongenge, despair. Forced to break their tapus, they believed they were no longer protected by the gods. They simply gave up. After taking them as slaves, the Maoris frequently found them in the morning dead in their houses. The worst massacre during the Maori conquest took place here at Waitangi. All the men, women and children of the area who did not escape were killed. On the beach they were laid out touching one another, the parent and the child. There were over 100 according to a survivor. He said some of the women with stakes thrust into them were left to die in their misery. In another instance, 50 Morioris were said to have been roasted in an oven.
Was the situation on the Chathams very similar to what happened to the Jews in Germany?
In some ways it was, yes, in that the effect of the Maori invasion of the Chathams was total. There was the business about forbidding the Moriori to marry. And the result was extermination or near extermination of a people, but not a deliberate policy of extermination as such. I think the Moriori people would have survived if the despair of being made slaves had not killed them.
It's entirely unfair to describe what happened as a case of genocide. Genocide has to do with a self-conscious attempt to exterminate an ethnic group. And in fairness, what happened was that the Maoris went to the Chatham Islands desperate to control some territory. They had been shunted down the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand and then finally driven from Wellington. And they wanted to own some land of their own. And they killed as many Morioris as it took to establish their legitimate claim, as it is in Maori law, to the ownership of the Chatham Islands.
If the Maori hadn't arrived in the Chathams in 1835, there's little doubt there would still be a living population of Moriori people. We can say that they would have suffered in the rest of the last century because European diseases took a great toll of the Maori in New Zealand. So on the Chathams, the Moriori would also have had problems, but 2,000 people in 1835, yes, they would certainly have survived, and there would have been a very vigorous population now, I would think.
Less than 300 Morioris were actually killed by the Maoris. However, their numbers declined incredibly quickly, from about 2,000 when the first outsiders arrived to 200 20 years after the invasion. The arrival of Christianity in 1842 brought an end to slavery, but by then it was too late. The race was doomed. That last-ditch plea to Governor Grey in 1862 for the return of land also contained a roll of all those the survivors could remember being alive at the time of the conquest.
Know by looking at the names that those with 2 crosses were killed and eaten. Those with 1 cross were taken prisoner or died. The total of men who died, 735. Those killed, 118. The women who died in despair, 601. Those killed and eaten, 108. Grand total, 1,562.
By the 1870s, there were less than 100 survivors. They were the remnant of a defeated race. Their spirit was broken, their culture swamped by the post-European Maori. The women became barren. Believing they were doomed, they gave up. This couple, blind and starving, were removed from here to spend their last years at Manukau. The people of Manukau, Margaret and Charles' people, were for some reason more resilient than others. They survived after the other tribes had died out. Anthropologists came here to learn the Moriori customs and traditions from men like Hirawanatapu. Without the knowledge they passed on, there'd be little to tell today. In the 1880s, they were still able to provide a glimpse of the Moriori as he had been. There were still some fine-looking men. Tapu with the long staff. Tommy Solomon's father. And a young Tommy Solomon. He grew up in a totally different world from his parents and grandparents, and died a Moriori in name only.
Now he is gone. The race is extinct.
In Moriori tradition, a blowhole marks the place where the spirits of the dead departed for the land of their forefathers. It was believed you could hear at the hole the sighs of the departed spirits. Those sighs have gone unheard, unheeded for many years. But Margaret and Charles Solomon have come close to understanding their message.
Well, I've come to understand better what it must have meant to be a Moriori.
Well, it's been unsettling to have to rethink who I am. At this moment, I can't identify as strongly with the Maori as I used to. But then there's nothing left of the Moriori culture to grasp onto. At times on the island I felt the presence of my ancestors, but there's so little left of the 1,000 years they lived here.
Our family relations are the only living link with a people, a culture. It's virtually disappeared.
Cha